If you disappear in the woods long enough, eventually the woods stop trying to give you back. That's the real fear behind Wrong Turn. Not the gore, not the traps, not even the cannibalism. It's the idea that somewhere beyond the edge of civilization, humanity could keep evolving without rules, without morality, without anyone left to stop it. Generations of isolation, inbreeding, survival at any cost. The terrifying part is the cannibals in Wrong Turn don't behave like movie slashers. They behave like predators. They understand the terrain. They understand fear. And by the time most victims realize they're being hunted, they're already fucked. Today, we're breaking down the biology, psychology, hunting behavior, environmental advantages, and disturbing realism behind the Cannibal clan from the Wrong Turn series. Because once you stop looking at these characters like generic horror villains and start looking at them like humans perfectly adapted to the environment, the entire franchise becomes way more disturbing than most people realize. So, if you enjoy horror analyzed like a real-world documentary, hit subscribe, ring the notification bell, and share the video, because the deeper we go into these woods, the worse it gets. The important thing to understand about Wrong Turn is that the franchise never treats the cannibals like supernatural entities. That matters, because unlike ghosts, demons, or immortal slashers, these characters are presented as something disturbingly human. Exaggerated? Absolutely. But still human. The films heavily imply generations of isolation deep within the Appalachian wilderness, where environmental pressure, violence, inbreeding, and survival-based behaviors slowly reshaped the people living there. And honestly, that premise taps into something primal. Because historically, isolated human populations absolutely existed. Remote mountain communities, tribal isolation, families cut off from civilization for decades, places where outside law barely existed. Now, obviously, Wrong Turn pushes this concept into horror movie territory. The deformities are exaggerated. The survivability is exaggerated. Some of the physical capabilities are clearly dramatized. But underneath all of that is a very real fear. What happens when human beings adapt to survival without civilization? That's the core idea behind the franchise. And once you realize that, the cannibals stop feeling like random horror movie monsters, and they start feeling like the end result of environmental adaptation taken to a horrifying extreme. Let's face it, most modern humans are terrible in the wilderness. This is probably the single most important idea in the entire franchise. The victims are almost always modern people, completely removed from survival environments. Tourists, travelers, college students, road trippers. People dependent on GPS, roads, lighting, medical access, communication systems, predictable infrastructure. And the second those systems disappear, they fall apart. That part is extremely realistic. Most modern humans are catastrophically unprepared for wilderness survival. People massively underestimate how dangerous forests become once you lose orientation. Your movement slows. Your visibility collapses. Sound becomes distorted. Distance becomes difficult to judge. Panic increases. Decision-making deteriorates. And panic is deadly in survival situations. The films repeatedly show victims making irrational decisions once fear takes over. Separating from groups, running blindly into unfamiliar terrain, making noise, ignoring injuries, abandoning defensive positions. That isn't bad writing. That's stress psychology. Under extreme fear, human decision-making becomes significantly worse, especially in unfamiliar environments. Meanwhile, the cannibals remain calm because the forest is their home. That creates an imbalance before the hunt even begins. This is where the franchise becomes much smarter than people give it credit for. Most slashers simply pursue victims. The Wrong Turn cannibals hunt them. There is a massive difference. Predators don't waste energy unnecessarily. They isolate targets, control movement, exploit terrain, attack at moments of weakness. And the cannibals repeatedly demonstrate all of those behaviors. They use elevated attack positions, hidden routes, camouflage, deadfall traps, tripwires, environmental choke points. At times, they behave less like movie villains and more like ambush hunters. That's important because ambush predators are terrifyingly effective in real life. A predator with environmental familiarity doesn't need superior intelligence. It just needs advantage. That's exactly what the cannibals have. They know where victims are likely to move, where terrain becomes difficult, where visibility drops, where escape options narrow. And the films consistently reinforce this. The victims are reactive. The cannibals are proactive. That distinction completely changes the dynamic. One of the smartest things Wrong Turn accidentally does is turn the environment itself into part of the threat. Most horror movies treat locations like backgrounds. Wrong Turn treats the forest like a weapon. And realistically, dense wilderness massively favors the people who understand it. Visibility becomes inconsistent. Movement becomes exhausting. Direction becomes unreliable. Humans navigate civilization visually. Road signs, streetlights, landmarks, technology. Forests strip most of that away. And once orientation disappears, panic takes over incredibly fast. There's a reason experienced survival experts emphasize staying calm after becoming lost. Because fear creates bad movement. Bad movement creates exhaustion. Exhaustion creates mistakes. The victims in Wrong Turn constantly make those mistakes because they're operating inside an environment the cannibals understand instinctively. The forest is basically a force multiplier. That's why primitive weapons suddenly become terrifying. Because terrain changes combat entirely. A bow inside dense forest terrain becomes dangerous. An axe becomes dangerous. A sharpened trap becomes dangerous. Modern people often assume technology automatically guarantees superiority. These films repeatedly show the opposite. This is probably one of the biggest misconceptions about the franchise. Characters like Three Finger are often dismissed as mindless killers. But behaviorally, that's not accurate at all. He demonstrates tool use, ranged combat ability, tracking behavior, environmental memory, coordinated attacks, trap construction, and situational patience. Those are intelligent behaviors, not civilized intelligence, predatory intelligence. There's a difference. A wolf doesn't need advanced reasoning to kill effectively. It needs timing, positioning, environmental understanding, and pattern recognition. The cannibals consistently demonstrate those traits, especially when hunting groups. And honestly, that's part of what makes them uncomfortable to watch. Because beneath the deformities and horror presentation, you're still watching human beings adapt strategically. That's deeply unsettling. Now, obviously, the franchise pushes physical appearance into extreme horror territory. But the underlying fear is grounded in reality. Long-term inbreeding can absolutely increase the likelihood of genetic disorders, physical abnormalities, developmental complications. The movies exaggerate this heavily for horror visual. But the concept itself is not fictional. And that's why the design works psychologically. The audience subconsciously understands there's a real-world foundation underneath the exaggeration. That creates discomfort because the cannibals don't feel impossible. They feel distorted, almost recognizable. And horror becomes much stronger when audiences can imagine some version of it existing. One of the darkest implications in Wrong Turn is that brutality itself becomes a survival mechanism. Think about the environment these characters exist in. Resources are limited. Medical care doesn't exist. Weakness becomes dangerous. In extreme environments, survival pressures become ruthless. The adaptable survive longer. The violent maintain control. The physically capable become dominant. Again, the films exaggerate this dramatically, but the underlying principle is real. Extreme conditions reward extreme behavior. That's why the cannibals feel so relentless. The environment itself filters out weakness, and over generations, that creates increasingly dangerous survivors. That idea is horrifying because it reframes the cannibals completely. They're not random killers. They're products of environmental pressure. This is another detail the franchise quietly gets right. People always assume modern weapons instantly solve survival situations. Not necessarily. Inside dense terrain, visibility drops, reaction times shorten, panic increases, angles disappear, and movement becomes restricted. The person who understands the terrain often has the advantage, especially in ambush situations. That's why guerrilla tactics historically worked against technologically superior forces. Environment changes warfare. The cannibals exploit that constantly. And honestly, that's part of what makes the movies feel believable, despite the exaggerated horror elements. Because the danger doesn't come from invincibility. It comes from control. The cannibals controlled the environment. The victims do not. The real horror isn't the gore. It isn't the traps. And it isn't even the cannibalism. It's regression. The franchise taps into a very old human fear. The fear of losing civilization. Because modern society creates the illusion that humans are separate from nature. But remove infrastructure long enough, and survival becomes primitive again, very quickly. That's the uncomfortable implication behind Wrong Turn. The cannibals represent humans adapting backwards into something more territorial, more violent, and more animalistic. Not because they're supernatural, but because survival reshaped them. And honestly, that idea sticks with people far longer than jump scares ever do. A lot of horror franchises stop being scary once the audience understands the formula. Wrong Turn still works because that core fear remains timeless. People are afraid of isolation. They're afraid of being hunted. They're afraid of environments where modern systems stop functioning. And deep wilderness still triggers something ancient in the human brain. The fear of being watched, tracked, cornered. That fear is older than civilization itself. The cannibals weaponized that fear perfectly. Not through supernatural powers, not through magic. Just adaptation, violence, and complete environmental dominance. And maybe that's the real truth behind Wrong Turn. The victims were never operating on equal ground to begin with. Because in those woods, the cannibals already won long before the hunt started.